My talk is about Kierkegaard. The words in the subtitle alternative might be somewhat, it's not really an alternative. It's more a straightforward exposition of Kierkegaard's investigation of the self and a contribution to the Western thinkers Nishitani mentions at the beginning of his essays, of Socrates, Saint Augustine, and Descartes. So the main points which I would like to stress is that Kierkegaard's investigation of the self is not strictly from the point of view of self-consciousness, but a dynamic interaction between the standpoint of self-consciousness and the standpoint of despair. So, existing is a problem, and any investigation of the self has to begin with the fact that the human being encounters itself as a question. But what does it mean for the self to become a question to itself? And wherein does this questionability express itself? And of course, what kind of understanding is needed to appropriately grasp appropriate to grasp the questionability. So, to understand and to understand are two things. This is what Kierkegaard calls the Socratic principle, which is the driving force, or the figure of Socrates is, of course, the driving force behind Kierkegaard's whole authorship. And just a side note, I will just use the name Kierkegaard instead of referring to the specific pseudonyms that he uses. So, due to the confusion between the different forms of understanding, modernity has forgotten what it means to be human. And in making the Socratic turn, Kierkegaard aims to rediscover the ethical conception of everyday life. This has far-reaching consequences for the understanding of the self. A fundamental aspect of the self is its passionate interest in its own existence. There is always something at stake, and any investigation that does not take this into account is doomed to fail. There is an infinite difference between understanding something in possibility and understanding the same thing in actuality. Genuine self-knowledge, as understanding something in actuality, is always self-transforming. And it is impossible to investigate the concrete human self from the point of view of disinterested reflection. Pure thinking, as thinking sub specie aeternitatis, can only reach the concept of the self. The actually existing single individual remains out of its reach. And the subjective thinker, which is a category Kierkegaard introduces in his concluding unscientific postscript, is his task, as contrasted to the pure thinker, which he sees embodied in Hegel, is to, while existing, hold together through passion. So the emotional aspect is also very important. Through passion, the qualitative disjunction of thinking and existing. So in this presentation, I will take Kierkegaard's investigation of the self in The Sickness Unto Death as my point of departure. It is written under the pseudonym of Anticlimacus, and which represents an ideal form of Christianity, which Kierkegaard acknowledges is even too high for him. So it's the things he writes actually under the pseudonym of Anticlimacus is also a direct critique of his own existence, which I find quite interesting. So The Sickness Unto Death is a very dense book, and there are a lot of ideas that come together, and so I hope I will try to give some kind of overview of some ideas contained in it. So through the fundamental existential phenomenon of despair, Kierkegaard tries to uncover what it means to be a self. So it is by way of the failure of the self to become itself that the true nature of the self comes into view. The first paragraphs of The Sickness Unto Death are amongst the most famous passages Kierkegaard has written. And to refresh your minds, I will just read the quotation, read the beginning. A human being is spirit. But what is spirit? Spirit is the self. But what is the self? The self is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation. The self is not a relation, but is the relations relating itself to itself. A human being is a synthesis of the finite and the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two, but considered in this way, a human being is still not a self. In the relation between two, the relation is a third, as a negative unity, and the two relate to the relation, and in the relation to the relation. Thus, under the qualification of the psychical, the relation between the psychical and the physical is a relation. If, however, the relation relates itself to itself, this relation is the positive third, and this is the self. So it's quite dense. And it seems that by starting The Sickness Unto Death like this, he starts from a clear-cut definition of what it means to be a self, then deduces what despair is as a consequence. But I think the investigation itself, or this definition, is more a result, which he afterwards placed at the beginning, than the starting point. Because, yes. To be sure, Kierkegaard did not live in an intellectual vacuum, and his view of the self is indebted to Kantian and post-Kantian philosophy. He explicitly mentions Fichte, for instance. I think that Kierkegaard breaks with this tradition insofar as he also investigates self from the standpoint of despair, as the way the self originally finds itself in actuality. And in this, he is of course indebted to Christianity. It's only Christianity, so he claims, and claim which we don't really agree with nowadays, which has thoroughly understood the nature of sinfulness, which it communicates through the offense, which is Christ. But the identification of despair and sin is not simply adopted from Christianity. Insight in the nature of despair and its identification with sin is Kierkegaard's own contribution. So even though The Sickness Unto Death subtitle is a Christian exposition for upbuilding and awakening, I do not think that it's correct to interpret it as a straightforward philosophical appropriation of Christianity, at least not the first part of the book. The second part of the book can be read as more a theological or a theology of sin. Well, so the self before God. Well, the first part has the human self itself as its own criterion. The subtitle also stresses the fact that the book is meant for upbuilding and awakening. According to Kierkegaard, Christian thinking should always be essentially upbuilding. Any form of disinterestedness or scholarliness is out of place. Care for the soul stands at the center of the exposition. So, starting point of Kierkegaard's investigation of the self is the failure of the self to be itself. There is no immediate health of the spirit. We are sick, or we find ourselves as being sick. We have been endowed with a task to become healthy. The proper way to investigate the self is therefore to start with the state of sickness rather than that of health. And an investigation of the self that is restricted to the standpoint of self-consciousness can never achieve this insight, since the categories of sickness and health pertain to existence. The sickness of the self manifests itself in existence, not in the medium of pure thinking. So, what is the self? The self is a self-relating relation, or the synthesizing activity, which in and through relating itself to itself, simultaneously relates to the power that established it. And that power is, of course, God, which he does not mention in the first part. But so, the human being is a psychosomatic synthesis. And in the synthesis, the relation between the constituents is the third. The self as a self-relating relation is a positive third. And Kierkegaard distinguishes it from the relation as a negative third. I think this should be understood as follows. So in the negative third, the constituents relate to each other through the relation. If I interpret myself as a synthesis of mind and body from the point of view of mind, I grasp the mind as that part of me which is not body. In this case, it is not a relation that relates itself to itself, but one of the constituents that relates itself to itself through its opposite. And because the mind is, in this case, the source of the relational activity, it will inevitably result in an imbalance of the synthesis. The I-ness of the human subject will be situated essentially in reflection. Reflection takes place in the medium of possibility. So that's the understanding that can never reach the actuality of the existing single individual. The human being is endowed with the task to become a self. This is the claim of eternity on the human being. So the self does not immediately coincide with itself, and this is expressed by negative phenomena such as anxiety and despair. And sickness is, of course, the state in which the self finds itself through anxiety, through despair. Despair is both untruth and the condition for truth, provided that the self acknowledges itself as untruth and becomes nothing in relation to the truth. As long as the self insists on having itself as its own criterion of having self-subsistence, there is no way to get out of the state of despair. So, aside from being a psychosomatic synthesis, Kierkegaard also describes the self as a synthesis of finitude, temporality and eternity, and possibility and necessity. So the fact that he considers the self to be established by another, by the power, by eternity, is because there are two forms of authentic despair. So not willing to be oneself, and to will to be oneself. So here we see that he interprets the self from the point of view of despair rather than concluding, making certain assumptions about despair from the point of view of consciousness. So despair pertains to the self-relating activity, and it is not a necessary result of the synthesis as such. Synthesis provides merely the possibility of despair. The being of the self is its becoming. It is movement, and despair is an immobilizing movement. The possibility of despair is what distinguishes the human being from non-human animals and nature. Despair is both a merit and a defect. Sickness entails the possibility of health. In the case of the self, the complete absence of despair is health, or, in other words, faith. Faith in the power that established the self itself. And to have faith means that in relating itself to itself and in willing to be itself, the self rests transparently in the power that established it. And here we, of course, have a resonance to Augustine's famous remark in the Confessions. Because the self, as I said before, eternity has a claim on the self, and this is I find this a very interesting quotation. I'm going to read it. The eternal in a person can be demonstrated by the fact that despair cannot consume his self. Precisely this is a torment of contradiction in despair. If there were nothing eternal in man, he could not despair at all. If despair could consume his self, then there would be no despair. So what is interesting is the fact that the eternal in a person can be demonstrated. I think the typical view of Kierkegaard is someone who just claims nothing can be known about fate, about God. It has to be a choice. But here there is obviously room for a more rational or an argument for the existence of the eternal. So despair is when the self despairs, it continually loses the eternal and also itself. But of course, at no moment is it completely severed from it. And the fact that the self cannot rid itself of itself indicates that there is something eternal in it. So in order to become concrete, a concrete self, it is necessary to despair. And only by having despaired is it possible to annihilate its very possibility. So that means that to reach the truth, one has to go through every negativity. What does it mean that despair is a sickness unto death? So Christianly understood, death is not the absolute end. That is the last negativity we have to go through in order to reach the truth, the last enemy to be destroyed. And as an immobilizing movement, despair is precisely the ability not to die, the inability to die. So it is unto death. The sickness is death is the end of the sickness, and the end is I sometimes get entangled in his dialectical webs. So yeah, death is sorry, I'm confused. Okay, let's go over to the actual investigation of despair. It can either be investigated abstractly through the constituents or by viewing it from the point of view as to whether the degree of consciousness the self has of its own despairing condition. So the case of the first pairs of opposites, despair can be the result of infinitude's lack of finitude, or vice versa. Finitude can despair through a lack of infinitude. In truth, the concrete self is characterized by a becoming that incessantly moves between two poles. It is to say that the progress of becoming must be an infinite moving away from itself in the infinitizing of the self, and an infinite coming back to itself in the finitizing process. The life of the Kierkegaardian mind consists of understanding, feeling, and willing. These three are rooted in the faculty of the imagination. And here we see the influence of post-Kantian and Fichtean philosophy. The imagination enables the self to infinitize itself. When left unchecked by finitude, can entice one to lead their lives in what Kierkegaard calls the fantastic. For example, the unnamed protagonist of the first part of Either Or, who is unable to make an actual choice. Infinitude without finitude is like walking on ice. Without the friction of the finite, infinitizing turns into a free-floating, aimless activity without reality. The despair of finitude, on the other hand, results from a lack of becoming, a lack of ideality. And without the ability to infinitize itself, this aspect of the self is and remains lifeless, which means that the self loses itself in conformity and only understands itself through comparison with others. A finitude devoid of infinitude is without movement, and the apparent stability of the self is due to the absence of any spiritual life. An important category is primitivity. It should not be understood in the usual sense in the English language of being less developed, but a more authentic selfhood with which an individual is endowed, and which it is endowed also with the task to become or to regain this primitivity. So the task is to take over this primitivity consciously and to become a self in the strict sense, to attain a second immediacy. So primitivity is the possibility of spirit, and to become a self is properly understood a backward movement, a return to one's source. The beginning is not that with which one begins, but is that to which one comes, and comes to it backward. The next pair of opposites are possibility and necessity, and in many ways, the relation between these two is analogous to that between infinitude and finitude. Everyone finds themselves already determined in a definitive manner by the historical and social and biological conditions. So the self is an activity characterized by an expanding movement of possibility and a contracting movement of necessity. And a self that remains oblivious to the fact that possibility needs necessity can never become concrete. Necessity is the place where possibility has to be realized. The movement Kierkegaard describes here is that of reduplication and inwardness. So without an either-or, reduplication is impossible. Without reduplication, a self can never become concrete. With God, everything is possible, not so with a human being. Without possibility, human existence withers. But an excess of possibility left unchecked by necessity stands in the way of concretion. The section of necessity's despair contains a digression on God. So Kierkegaard defines God as everything. For God, everything is possible, and God is that everything is possible. And in a short piece, The Changelessness of God, which is the last one Kierkegaard ever published in 1955, we read that at every moment he, so God, holds all actuality as possibility in his omnipotent hand. And the metaphor of the hand also returns, or is also in The Sickness Unto Death, where he writes that God, who has constituted man as a relation, releases it from his hand, so that in as much as the relation relates itself to itself. So the human being has been granted so the ability or the responsibility for its own, for the reduplication of its own possibility into actuality, which is of course has a very tragic character to it, so far as we can easily forget or lose ourselves in frivolity and just enjoyment of the earthly. So what is the relation between the pairs of infinitude and finitude and possibility and necessity? Because they seem to express the same movement in the self. So what is the point of distinguishing them? Given the explicit mention of the faculty of imagination in the discussion of infinitude and finitude, it seems to me that this synthesis pertains specifically to the reflective self, the self in the medium of abstraction, which consists of thinking, feeling, and willing. The synthesis of the between possibility and necessity thematizes the human being, the medium of actuality. And so the medium of abstraction and the medium of actuality are related through the concept of reduplication, which I already mentioned. Reduplication is the intensification of thought, the existential realization of what is known, which is an inexplicable qualitative leap, a discontinuity within the self through which the self becomes itself, to which, of course, there's always a danger that because it's a discontinuity, the self loses itself. The self, as a self-relating relation, is essentially reduplication. And I think this is important to see that when Kierkegaard says that the self is a relation that relates itself to itself, it's not primarily self-consciousness, but the act of making a choice, of realizing possibility within actuality. Ethical reduplication is mediated by the eternal, the source of possibility. Reduplication is achieved through the moment, the atom of eternity. Because the future is eternity's incognito in time, the moment is the future's incarnation in the now. And the proper way to relate to the future is through choice, through an either-or. But let's take a step back. Why does Kierkegaard say that the human self is a synthesis in the first place? Synthesis needs to be constantly held together. The opposites have to be balanced at every moment, and the possibility of a misrelation is ever present. Because it is essentially a relation relating itself to itself, which has been established by another, self has no self-subsistence. The human self is essentially becoming, not being. It is a restless movement between the opposites. But the decisive qualification is the degree in which the despairing self is conscious of his or her despair. An intensification of despair goes hand in hand with an intensification of consciousness. Section C.B. Traces the different ideal figures of despair with regard to the consciousness one has of the self. And the perspective is twofold. There is a constant interplay between the point of view of the patient, that is the self-understanding, and the point of view of the physician. So on the one hand, Kierkegaard reconstructs the self-understanding or lack of self-understanding that characterizes a particular form of despair from within. And on the other hand, he analyzes the causes of the misrelation and its relation to the other forms of despair as an observer. And it is interesting that Kierkegaard especially connects the self or the self-consciousness with the will. and there is no mention of either thinking or feeling. This, of course, does not mean that thinking or feeling are essential to the self-consciousness. It rather indicates that what is decisive for the self is its relation to the future, rather than the past, as it was in Greek philosophy. So what distinguishes the human self, whose being is becoming, is the actuality of the future in their existence. And this also changes the nature of the relation of humans to their past. Things have a past, but human beings have a history. So even though the investigation of the forms of despair, the ideal forms of despair are one of the most important chapters, will be rather brief because its highly narrative character makes it quite difficult within the scope of a presentation to give it the attention it deserves. So the lowest form of despair is not even aware that it has an eternal self. Consequently, it is completely oblivious to the fact that it is actually in despair. And the ignorance of this being in despair, something innocent about it. And this is why Kierkegaard even hesitates whether it is permissible to consider this form of despair to be despair at all. If spirit is completely absent, there can be no sickness of the self either. The two forms of despair, of authentic despair, are despair not willing to be oneself and despair willing to be oneself. They are not completely separated. The former, which he calls despair and weakness, contains something of the latter form, which he calls despair of defiance, vice versa. In despair, not willing to be oneself, the self wills to be itself, insofar as it wants to become what it is. And in despair, willing to be oneself, the self does not will to be itself, insofar as it wants to be what it is not. And as I understand it, what separates these two forms of despair depends on the aspects of the self-relating relation, which is stressed, either the internal relation of this relation, or the relation of the self to the power that established it. So we want to be sovereign, but the irony is, of course, that we can only rebel against our dependence on the power that established us by means of that very power. The most intense form of despair is called the demonic, and it is precisely this conscious rebelling against that which constitutes our existence. Despair and weakness is much less aware of the fact that it's not about so just to an overview of the intensification of the consciousness through despair. So first we despair in weakness over something earthly. As our despair intensifies, we start despairing over our weakness. And the more intense the despair, the more despair becomes despair of the eternal. So the most pure form of despair, the demonic, is an actual rebellion against the eternal, and one holds on to its own despair and the eternal and makes one's agony proof of the faultiness of existence. All this takes place within the self that has itself as its criterion. It is not yet sin in the strict sense. Only with the conception of God, knowing oneself to be before God, does authentic despair turn into sin. In the sickness unto death, the contrast between sin and faith is ever present. Faith, which constitutes the health of the self, is only present implicitly. And I just want to conclude, shortly indicate what it means for the self to rest transparently in the power that established it. And who can teach us what it means to be healthy? According to the gospel, to find the answer to this question, we have to humble ourselves and let ourselves be taught by the lily in the field and the bird of the air. They can teach us what it means to lead an existence that is grounded in faith. And how do they teach? Simply through simplicity, because simplicity means that the teacher himself is what he teaches. In this passage, significantly, the issue at hand is our relation to the future. So, let tomorrow take care of itself, it is said, and first seek the kingdom of God. Is this not a completely impractical and highly irresponsible piece of advice? Perhaps, but before we turn a deaf ear to the admonishment of the gospel, let us hear what the lily and the bird have to tell us. And according to Kierkegaard, there are three things we can learn from them: silence, obedience, and joy. The first lesson is the art of becoming silent. The ability to speak is intrinsic to being human. It would be wrong, however, to conclude from this that the fact that the more we speak, the more human we are. Speech brings with it the possibility of silence. And being able to keep silence is the precondition of the most divine thing a human being can do: listen. The divine can be heard, the moment can be noticed, only if we learn to listen to the silence that pervades reality. The second thing we can learn from them is obedience. In nature, everything is unconditional obedience. The difference between nature and the human being is that, having been released from God's hand, so to speak, the human being has a task to become, in freedom, absolutely obedient. And the human being is therefore confronted with a choice to become either infinitely less than nature or infinitely more. I realize it is as a quite problematic statement, probably, perhaps. And the last lesson we can learn is joy. What is joy? Or what does it mean to be joyful? It is to be truly present to oneself. But truly to be present to oneself is this today. This to be today, truly to be today. When we have faith and rest transparently in the eternal, we have attained a state of simplicity. The life of simplicity is joyful. And by means of the future, we come back to ourselves in the present and are at rest. This is a higher immediacy, a second immediacy. And the second immediacy is suffused with the eternal, which shields us against the merciless perishing of the temporal and enables us to be unconditionally joyful. So, to conclude, I wish to say a few words about the title of the presentation. The point when I wrote pointing directly to one's sickness, it is not, I do not have in mind Kierkegaard's treatise, but the offense, Christ, which is the starting point of Kierkegaard's exploration of the self. Christ is a sign of contradiction who discloses a person's heart through the way they respond to him. He is the offense, the paradox, which can only be communicated indirectly. The problem of communication is the distinction between direct and indirect communication lies at the center of Kierkegaard's thought. I believe that this is also a core issue for Zen, which is symbolized in the koan in particular, which is something Nishitani does not treat in his essay. The investigation of the self is both a communal and a highly personal activity. These both aspects can only be harmonized by means of indirect communication, rather than direct communication, which merely informs by conveying a body of information. This was actually my first idea for my presentation, but I didn't feel confident enough to talk about the koan. So I would like to explore this idea of communication also in Zen and Kierkegaard more in depth in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have 5 minutes for maybe a couple of questions.
I'm pretty sure that Nishitani would have been happy to add Kierkegaard as an analog or a counterpart to his the three examples that he gives in examples of Koji Kyume, which he gives in the Standpoint of Zen. You know, we've added to Socrates, Augustine, and Descartes. Just as a piece of information that's peripheral to your presentation, in 1978, Nishitani in Kyoto would go to Otani University and give a seminar on sickness unto death in English for whoever wanted to come. There were only about four, five, 6 people. I was able to go to 2 or 3 of these sessions. So we read the text in English, and Nishitani would speak freely without notes, whatever came to mind. And as I recall, the emphasis he emphasized what appears in the first two or three pages of that text, the definition Kierkegaard offers, not simply as a self-relating relation, but he emphasized the relating, the dynamic activity of Kierkegaard's definition. And he took it more in the direction, as I recall at least, away from a self relating into the possibility of relating with others. So true self-relating for him, as I recall at least, seemed to be more communal, as you just mentioned a minute ago, and again directed towards others. So, for example, he would. This would explain, for example, how it's possible for Kierkegaard to advise us or to command us to become who we are, to become who you are, because it's an activity, it's a total activity or a kind of practice whose goal is not exterior, and therefore the practice can't be a method to reach a goal outside of oneself, but it has to be a sort of an interiorization. So he said something along those lines. And of course, in place of God as the power in whom what we rest and the power that establishes us, he, as I recall, took it in a more Buddhistic direction. That power would be the relating of interdependence, or the other side of that would be the field of nothingness, which establishes us, and it also, in a certain sense, disestablishes us and replaces self-relating with the relating to other. So in any case, this was, I thought you might be interested to know that Nishitani himself was very interested in this particular text.
Well, and actually another Danish philosopher which I worked on, Løgstrup, tried to, well, his main criticism of Kierkegaard was that Kierkegaard levels down finitude and quite easily jumps from other people to the crowd. And Løgstrup tries to integrate more, I think it's not, what Kierkegaard writes does not exclude a more dynamic relation with others, but he eliminates that possibility by going directly to one's personal passionate interest in one's own relation to eternity. Well, for Løgstrup, which is also why it's very he's very hostile to the first immediacy, Kierkegaard. It's actually, I find it's a very intellectualistic anti-intellectualism which Kierkegaard has. So yes, it's I think Nishitani would like to have read Lögstrup's critique of Kierkegaard. So but I completely agree with you, and thank you for the anecdote also. Oh.